Object of Art, Contemporary Reconsiderations of the Aesthetic. At this time, I'd also like to remind you that our lecture next week will be presented at this same time and place by Professor Rita Felsky of the University of Virginia. And now, Brian McKee from the English course associated with this lecture series will introduce tonight's speaker.
The list of accomplishments which I am about to read to you would best be described as severely abridged. Arthur Danto recently retired from his position as Johnsonian Professor of Emeritus Philosophy at Columbia University. He has published extensively on a wide range of topics, including epistemology, action theory, the philosophy of history, the history of philosophy, aesthetics, and art criticism. Many of these works have been awarded prizes and honors. To list a few, The Transfiguration of the Commonplace was awarded the Lionel Trilling Book Prize. Encounters and Reflections was awarded the National Book Critics Circle Prize in Criticism. Robert Mapplethorpe was awarded the 9th Annual ICP Infinity Prize for Photography Writing. His most recent book, published in 1994, is a collection of essays entitled Embodied Meanings. Perhaps even more telling than the magnitude of his own body of work, however, is the enormous volume of publications about Danto's work. He has been writing since 1984 as the art critic for The Nation, has served as editor for the Journal of Philosophy, and as president for both the American Philosophical Association and the American Society for Aesthetics. The lecture which Professor Danto is presenting tonight is entitled From Aesthetics to Art Criticism. It would be difficult to refer to Danto's theories in this area without due reference to the oft-repeated story of his revelatory confrontation with Andy Warhol's Brillo boxes. It was there that the relationship between art and theory became clear to him. In his own words, taken from his seminal essay, The Art World, what in the end makes the difference between a Brillo box and a work of art consisting of a Brillo box is a certain theory of art. It is the theory that takes it up into the world of art and keeps it from collapsing into the real object, which it is, in a sense of is, other than artistic identification. Of course, without the theory, one is unlikely to see it as art, and in order to see it as part of the art world, one must have mastered a good deal of artistic theory as well as a considerable amount of the history of recent New York painting. Broadly speaking, then, Danto has been intensely aware of the complex interaction between art and theory, and certainly it is the dynamics of this relationship that lie at the heart of much of his own theory and criticism. It is with great pleasure, then, that I introduce to you Arthur Danto.
Thank you very much for that, Brian. That was a nice introduction. When I started to write about the visual arts, when I started to do the philosophy of art, I tended to keep questions of aesthetics at bay. I didn't know how to deal with them, to tell you the truth. And that meant that I tended to keep the grand tradition of the philosophy of art at bay as well, because most of what philosophers in that tradition wrote about was aesthetics. The talk this evening is, in a way, an effort to put some grounding under that impulse to try and suggest ways in which aesthetics might have something to do with art, but it's got to be a very qualified notion of aesthetics and have relatively little to do with the traditional categories of aesthetics, the beautiful and the ugly and the like. And it's called From Aesthetics to Art Criticism. I want to begin by citing a passage from Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophical masterpiece, The World as Will and Idea, in which Schopenhauer speaks of the relationship between two, as he sees it, antithetical values, beauty and utility. He's discussing the romantic notion of the genius, which he identifies as the intellect working independently of the will, so that, in his language, the productions of genius serve no useful purpose. And this is the passage. The work of genius may be music, philosophy, painting, or poetry. It is nothing for use or profit. To be useless and unprofitable is one of the characteristics of works of genius. It is their patent of nobility. All other works exist only for the maintenance and relief of our existence. Only those here discussed do not. They alone exist for their own sake and are to be regarded in this sense as the flower of existence. Our heart is therefore gladdened at the enjoyment of them, for we rise out of the heavy earthly atmosphere of need and want. Now, that powerful distinction drawn in one of the great originating works of philosophical aesthetics between aesthetic and practical considerations has tended to stultify any propensity to ask what practical utility aesthetic experience itself might have. For questions of practicality are defined by interests an individual or a particular group might have, by what Schopenhauer refers to as the will. But Kant, in the work that generated a tradition which included Schopenhauer and which extends well into modern times, writes that, and this is Kant, taste is the faculty of judging of an object or a method of representing it by an entirely disinterested satisfaction or dissatisfaction. The object of such satisfaction is called the beautiful. Schopenhauer contended that analogous to the way in which aesthetics and utility are disjoint from one another, we rarely, he says, see the useful united with the beautiful. The most beautiful buildings are not the useful ones. A temple is not a dwelling house. Modernism has not been quite so abrupt. The Museum of Modern Art displays objects of acknowledged utility, which exemplify principles of aesthetic high style. The Barnes Collection outside Philadelphia displays amidst the masterpieces of painting and sculptures objects of unmistakable utility. The furniture of the Shakers, of which modernists greatly approve, seem clearly to fuse beauty and utility. Still, Schopenhauer might ask to what degree the beauty is related to the utility. A spark plug might be considered by some a beautiful object, with its knurled and polished surfaces and its exquisitely proportioned distribution of metal and ceramic parts. But it would, so far as beautiful, satisfy no interest of the sort spark plugs exist to serve. If you were anxious to have a spark plug worked, issues of spark plug beauty would be beside the point. For to judge it beautiful would be, according to Kant, as an object of, quote, an entirely disinterested satisfaction, since every interest spoils the judgment of taste. And the puzzling question would certainly be, what kind of satisfaction could that be? For what would constitute satisfaction if there were no interest to be served? Let's follow Kant in speaking as if there were a kind of satisfaction in itself, a kind of satisfaction an sich, distant philosophical relative of the Ding an sich, or the thing in itself. Just as the thing in itself exists independently of everything else, satisfaction in itself depends, as the classical aestheticians insisted, upon no possible practical interest, nor on its satisfaction. It immediately follows that aesthetic considerations are extruded from the realm of function and utility, a momentous consequence which has been taken to justify the elimination of ornament and decoration from the domain of architectural design and the elimination of art subsidies from the federal budget as frill by definition. So as artworks fall under the category of the, that is to say, so far, at least, as artworks fall under the category of the aesthetic. Like the limited beauty of a spark plug, beauty may be an accidental byproduct of features for each of which there's a good, clear, practical justification. But the beauty plays no further role in accounting for how a spark plug works or why it works. No distinction is especially drawn between natural and artistic beauty in Kant. He writes, "Nature is beautiful because it looks like art. And art can only be called beautiful if we are conscious of it as art, while yet it looks like nature." So the judgment of beauty may be invariant as to whether it's beautiful art or some naturally beautiful thing. And though we may be mistaken in the event of illusion as to whether or not it is art, we're not mistaken in point of its beauty. Beautiful art, he says, must look like nature. Schopenhauer, for all his emphasis upon genius, sees the disjunction between beauty and utility in objects which would not ordinarily be ascribed to genius. Tall and fine trees, he says, bear no fruit. Fruit trees are small, ugly, and stunted. The double garden rose is not fruitful, but the small, wild, almost scentless rose is. There's something scary in that line of thought, which seems to want to connect usefulness and plainness, if not usefulness and ugliness. Perhaps you can get a sense of what's scary in Schopenhauer's way of thinking if you consider the German contrast between gut and schlecht, different from the contrast between gut and böse, that is to say, good and bad, as over and against good and evil. And Nietzsche, who was Schopenhauer's great disciple, shows us in the genealogy of morals how good designated what the masters claimed they were, they themselves, by virtue of the traits that defined them. Traits the slaves, of course, called evil. But at least they weren't schlecht, the masters might say, like the slaves who were the human equivalent of the small, ugly, stunted fruit trees. But my interest lies in drawing out the thought common to Kant and to Schopenhauer that there is no special line to be drawn between the beautiful in art and in nature. For that leads by a path worn smooth by those who've taken this disjunction between beauty and utility as a deep truth, from philosophical aesthetics to a highly influential form of the practice of art criticism, construed as the discrimination of good art from bad art on, if you like, aesthetic grounds. In any case, there's nothing other than the knowledge that it is art one's experiencing which distinguishes what Clement Greenberg calls quality in art from the beautiful in nature. Beautiful art is gut. If art lacks beauty or quality, it's schlecht. Greenberg was a really great art critic and very influential art critic, and much of this lecture really is about Greenberg as a kind of Kantian art critic, and he has about as good a shot, I think, as anybody's had of trying to do art criticism based upon the distinctions I began by simply recording. The qualification, knowledge that it's art one's experiencing, ought to sound a warning that if the beautiful is invariant to artworks and to other things, well, it should almost immediately follow that beauty forms no part of the concept of art, though in Kant's time it would have been taken as a matter of course that artworks as a class aimed at beauty, and beauty was implied by their existence, even though they might fail in that aim. Once more, just consider a spark plug, which everybody here is familiar with. Spark plugs certainly wouldn't have existed in Kant's time, nor, contrary to historical fact, could they have been artworks if they'd existed. They couldn't have existed because the state of industrial ceramics and of metallurgy hadn't evolved enough to have produced something like the modern spark plug, quite apart from the fact that the mechanism which gives rise to the spark plug, the internal combustion engine, hadn't certainly been thought of in Kant's time. But imagine even so that a spark plug slipped through some kind of a time warp and was found by a woodcutter just outside Königsberg in 1790. It would be incapable of satisfying any interest at that time, as what Heidegger calls the Zeugganz, the complex of tools, in which it could do so, was not going to be in place for a century and a half. So it would have value only as some kind of curiosity. Well, I think of like coconuts, for example, which in the 16th century would occasionally be found washed up on the shores of Europe. You'd pick up a coconut and say, this must be good for something. But nobody knew about coconuts, and so the question would be, well, what could it be good for? There exist coconuts that are brilliantly carved by Nuremberg craftsmen and fashioned into cups. They thought maybe they're good for telling poison if you put something in it. So if you were rich enough, you could have a coconut cup carved maybe by some colleague of Albrecht Dürer's, but in the main, they were just puzzling objects, and a spark plug in 1790 would be puzzling just for those reasons. A time-displaced spark plug might find a place in the camera, the room of curiosities of Frederick the Great, where it would be an object of contemplation, maybe, which was forcibly disinterested, since there was nothing other than contemplation one could do with a spark plug in 1790. I mean, unless you said, well, I'll use it as a paperweight, that is to say, which seems to violate the tremendous promise of utility every spark plug has as its birthright. It would almost exactly fit Kant's characterization of beauty as purposiveness without specific purpose. I mean, it looks awfully purposive, but what would be its purpose? Nobody could have given an answer at that time. It would look too useful to be ornamental, but no one could imagine how. In any case, it could not, given the state of art, be a work of art in 1790. Today, in consequence of some mischief, really, engendered by Marcel Duchamp circa 1917, a spark plug could be a work of art, albeit obviously not for reasons of its beauty. Let me first of all see if that works. And now, hold your breath. Okay. I knew I was going to have trouble with this one. Oh, okay. Now I'm going to have trouble seeing what I'm trying to tell you. It's not spectacularly in focus, I don't think. Let's see if I can do something about that.
Maybe the other way. That's going
good. Here it goes. Yeah. I mean, that was quite an experience. All right. Great. This is an example, a late example of, there were a few done after that, of a group of objects that Duchamp calls ready-mades. This question of how many ready-mades he actually himself exhibited. This he exhibited at the Society of, or tried to exhibit at the Society of Independent Artists in 1917, but he didn't acknowledge that it was his. It was exhibited under the name R. Mutt. It was the artist whose signature you see, and it's got a date, 1917. That was taken, that was photographed at the gallery 291 of Alfred Stieglitz, and it's the only form in which this work exists in a photograph. That is, has what philosophers would have called objective but not formal reality. The urinal was lost sometime in after May 1917, when Stieglitz closed his gallery, and it's disappeared, but there are plenty of objects reasonably similar to it in the world. When I say reasonably similar, nothing is exactly similar to it, because when the Museum of Modern Art undertook to put on a show with some of the ready-mades in it, they looked for what is called Bedfordshire flatback 8-bolt, etc. urinal, and with all its resources, the Museum of Modern Art couldn't find one in the United States. You'd be fairly rich, I suppose, if you could find one, but so you can look around yard sales. But this one has been lost, but fortunately, Stieglitz has given us this absolutely marvelous photograph. I'll tell you what Stieglitz was interested in, because it's in its own way interesting. Stieglitz was fascinated by the shadow. Never would have occurred to you or me, but that shadow there, which, as you can see, gives that strange form, which Stieglitz felt, well, looked like the Buddha or the Virgin Mary, as a matter of fact. And we have from Carl van Vechten an account of how Stieglitz adjusted the lights for the sake of that extraordinary shadow. But of course, that was no part of what Duchamp was interested in when he did whatever it was that he did, when he tried to get that accepted as a work of art. In any case, the ready-made objects, and a spark plug would have been such an object had Duchamp decided to exhibit a spark plug. They were seized upon precisely because of their aesthetic nondescriptness. And he demonstrated that if they were art, but not beautiful, then beauty indeed could form no defining attribute of art. And the recognition of that, one might say, is what draws so sharp a line between traditional aesthetics and the philosophy of art, and indeed the practice of art today. That line was at first very faint in general consciousness when Duchamp sought to get that exhibited in 1917 under a false signature and the title Fountain. Even members of Duchamp's immediate circle, like Walter Arensberg, who was his patron, thought Duchamp was drawing attention to the white gleaming beauty of the urinal, as if an artist whose philosophical agenda was in part to extrude the aesthetic from the artistic were bent upon reducing works of art to aesthetic objects in the manner of Kant or Schopenhauer. There's an argument recorded between Arensberg and the artist George Bellows in 1917. Bellows was on the hanging committee, really, of the Society of Independent Artists, in which Arensberg said, "A lovely form has been revealed, freed from its functional purposes. There a man has clearly made an aesthetic contribution. But in 1962, Duchamp wrote to the surrealist Hans Richter, "When I discovered ready-mades," Duchamp said, "I thought to discourage aesthetics. I threw the bottle rack and the urinal in their faces as a challenge, and now they admire them for their aesthetic beauty." Clement Greenberg, who has already made an entrance into this lecture, certainly the foremost Kantian art critic of modern times, had little use and less patience with Marcel Duchamp as an artist. And I want to discuss Greenberg's achievement against the background of a distinction I regard as crucial between aesthetic objects and works of art. Kant, Greenberg conceded, had bad taste and scant experience with art. Yet, and this is Greenberg writing, yet his capacity for abstraction enabled him, despite many gaffes, to establish in his critique of aesthetic judgment what is the most satisfactory basis for aesthetics we yet have. I'm anxious to discuss Greenberg because his way of doing art criticism has become extremely problematic. Philosophy, in an art world, almost defined by Duchamp as its generative thinker. Greenberg's aesthetic philosophy is being carried forward, to be sure, still in a magazine like the New Criterion by critics like Hilton Kramer, and the New Criterion pivots precisely on the issue of what Greenberg calls quality in art, or art that is gut, or I suppose aesthetically good, if we would translate it that way, which Kramer identifies precisely with aesthetic quality, but which Duchamp and his followers, and I just have to count myself one of Duchamp's legions of followers, would identify in some other way. Now, I'm uncertain that one can come up with a sort of unified field theory of artistic goodness, I'm uncertain about that, nor hence am I certain whether one can explain the artistic goodness of works Greenberg prized for their aesthetic goodness in some other terms. But I at least know that it is bad critical practice to dismiss works which lack aesthetic goodness in Greenberg's terms as artistically bad. The urinal may have aesthetic goodness. I mean, that's what Ahrensberg thought, that it was a beautiful object and so forth. But I'm not sure the work, which has a complex relationship to the object, that has aesthetic goodness, or that the aesthetic qualities of that piece of plumbing have very much to do with what I think of as the artistic qualities of a work called Fountain, done in 1917. The work was done in 1917. When the urinal was made, I mean, that's anybody's guess. If a unified field theory is not to be had, well, art criticism is probably a pretty divided practice. Whether, in addition, it needs to be an essentially conflicted practice, that remains to be decided. And I tend to feel that a close examination of the way in which Greenberg sought to ground his own critical practice gives us a reason, in Kantian aesthetics, facilitates that decision. But the existence of that conflict gives us a reason to examine the background in aesthetic theory from which it arises. A theory which entails a conflict in application has itself to be a conflicted theory, just as a set of axioms is inconsistent if it entails a contradiction. The conflict was screened by historical accident that aesthetics was hammered out as a discipline at a time when art had been singularly stable in its practice and conception over several centuries, and where such revolutions in art as there may have been were in the nature of reversions to earlier traditions, from Rococo to neoclassicism in the time of Kant, and from Romanticism to pre-Raphaelitism in the time of Schopenhauer. Modernism began insidiously. Well, it's hard to know when modernism quite begins. A lot of people think it begins with Manet around 1863 when he exhibits the Déjeuner sur l'herbe at the Salon des Refusés in Paris. But my feeling is that it begins sometime after that. My way of thinking about the beginnings of modernism is sometime in the 1880s. But it didn't especially force aestheticians to rethink their distinctions, which fit fairly readily with Cézanne and with Kandinsky, and could even, as we saw, be made to fit or seem to fit with an artist as revolutionary as Duchamp. Aesthetics seems decreasingly adequate to deal with art after the mid-1960s, with what I call art after the end of art. That brings in a theory that I'm simply going to refer to without discussing much this evening. It's a sign of which was an initial disposition to refuse to consider non- or anti-aesthetic art as art at all. That parallels the reflex, which consists in regarding abstract art as not art at all, which Greenberg, as an advocate of abstraction, himself had to deal with at an earlier stage in 20th century discussion. That momentary crisis was overcome by revising the theory that art must be mimetic, a felicitous move which classical aesthetics facilitated precisely through the weak distinction it insisted upon between artistic and natural beauty, leaving it now open that all that mattered was aesthetic quality, and a work of art, if it were abstract, was beautiful if it were beautiful, in the same way in which choose any natural object or situation you want. But classical aesthetic theory could not be appealed to with art after the end of art, precisely because it seemed to scorn aesthetic quality, and to scorn it in a way very different from the way that Duchamp seemed to, because at that time, in 1917, you saw no way to deal critically with an object unless you found some way of thinking about it under the category of aesthetics, hence as beautiful. It was precisely in terms, as I say, of classical aesthetics that the refusal to call it art was grounded, and that was what the debates with the Hanging Committee in 1917 were grounded on. Once its status as art was established, it was fairly clear that aesthetics as a theory was badly in need of repair if it was to be helpful in dealing with art at all. And in my view, this was going to mean the overhauling of the distinction between the aesthetic and the practical as the default base of the discipline. But let's return to aesthetics-based art criticism and Clement Greenberg's views. Greenberg was my predecessor as critic for The Nation magazine that I write for. Now Greenberg was its critic 1942 to 49, so that gives you some sense of what this historical span is. Greenberg derives two tenets from his reading of Kant. The first was based on a famous formulation of the relationship between the judgment of beauty and the application of rules. The concept of beautiful art does not permit the judgment upon the beauty of a product to be, and this is a quotation from Kant, The concept of beautiful art does not permit the judgment upon the beauty of a product to be derived from any rule which has a concept as its determining ground and therefore has as its basis a concept of the way in which the product is possible. Therefore, beautiful art cannot itself devise the rule according to which it can bring about its product. The very notion of beauty is incompatible with the notion of there being rules. That was a thought of Kant's. Critical judgment, in Greenberg's view, operates in the abeyance of rule. He says, quality in art can be neither ascertained nor proved by logic or discourse. Experience alone rules in this area. And the experience, so to speak, of experience. This is what all the serious philosophers of art since Immanuel Kant have concluded. So, what Greenberg calls the most satisfactory basis for aesthetics we yet have was nothing less than the most satisfactory basis for art criticism, as Greenberg believed himself to practice it. He credited himself, certainly Greenberg did, with good taste, a matter in part of temperament and in part of experience. He says, the practiced eye tends always toward the definitely and positively good in art, knows it there, and will be dissatisfied with anything else. Will, in brief, be dissatisfied with anything less than the satisfying an sich, the satisfying in itself. The Kantian art critic, pressed for an answer to the question of what good is art, what art is good for, has to deflect the question as reflecting a philosophical misunderstanding. What does practicality have to do with art, the Kantian critic would say, and that would be the rhetorical retort of those persuaded that art exists for aesthetic satisfaction alone, for satisfaction, that's to say, in itself or an sich. So the same logical gulf that separates the aesthetic from the practical separates art from anything useful. And Kantian aesthetics has served the contemporary conservative art critic pretty well in setting aside as irrelevant to art any instrumental ambitions artists might have of putting art to work in the service of this or that human interest, and most particularly, of course, political interest. What has art got to do with politics? The conservative critic asks, as if the question were rhetorical, and the answer obvious, namely nothing. Greenberg's second Kantian tenet derives from the deep reason in Kant's system why the aesthetic was strictly segregated from the practical. It was so because the judgment of beauty had to be tacitly universal for Kant, and universality would be incompatible with interest and hence with practicality. In all judgments by which we describe anything as beautiful, we allow no one to be of another opinion. That's Kant writing, nor not as a prediction that everyone, I quote, will agree with my judgment, but that everyone ought. Kant invokes a special notion of what he terms subjective universality, which bases itself on the postulation of a certain kind of sensus communis, a certain kind of common sensibility, which in turn allows a certain parity of form between moral and aesthetic judgments in his system. Greenberg derives from the tacit universality of aesthetic judgment the thesis that art is really all of a piece. He was particularly intent on demonstrating that there's no difference in our aesthetic experience of abstract as against representational art. That was a fairly aggravated issue at that time. Remember, he was writing at a time when critics were enough uncertain about abstract painting that they were prepared to argue that experiencing it was different in kind from experiencing representational art. In 1961, Greenberg writes as follows, and this is pretty interesting. He says, experience itself, and experience is the only court of appeal in art, experience has shown that there is both bad and good in abstract art. And it has also revealed that the good in one kind of art is always at bottom more like the good in all other kinds of art than it is like the bad in its own kind. Underneath all apparent differences, a good Mondrian or a good Pollock has more in common with a good Vermeer than a bad Dali has. A bad Dali has more in common not only with a bad Maxfield Parrish, but with a bad abstract painting. And Greenberg goes on to say that people who do not make the effort to experience or appreciate abstract art, he says they do not have the right to pronounce on any kind of art, much less abstract art. They do not because they've not taken the trouble to amass sufficient experience of it, and it makes no difference in that respect how much experience they have in other fields of art. To be seriously interested in art, one might paraphrase Greenberg as saying, is to be seriously interested in the good in art. One is not, and I quote him further, one is not for Chinese or Western or representational art as a whole, but only for what is good in it. And Greenberg's second tenet entails that the practiced eye can pick out the good from the bad in art of whatever sort, independently of any specific knowledge of the circumstances of production in the tradition to which the art belongs. The owner of the practiced eye is aesthetically everywhere at home. Recently, for example, I heard a rather well-known curator say that it doesn't have to know anything about African art. He can pick out what's good from what's bad just because he's got a good eye. As though it were totally irrelevant what good art means in Africa, say, or as though what the Africans were really interested in was aesthetic goodness, when what they were interested might instead have been something of a very different nature. But that's a Greenbergian view. Greenberg's strengths and weaknesses as a critic, I think, derived from those two tenets. It was, for example, his confidence that the good is everywhere and always the same that underlay his openness to goodness, to which others in his era were often largely blind. And that explains his early identification, for instance, of Jackson Pollock as a great painter. Here is he and she, male and female, sorry. This is a work of Pollock's from 1943. It's long before, well, not long before, but well before Pollock had broken through to the famous style and strategy with which we identify him. Here is another Pollock from that time that is a work called Pacifier, and it's got a classical allusion, as you know, and it's an extraordinary work of art. But Greenberg really did see the goodness in Pollock well before the world in general saw Pollock's goodness. And I think little in the way in which abstract painting was produced in the 1940s would have prepared anyone for Pollock's work. and the ability to sense its artistic goodness, even to proclaim its artistic greatness, as Greenberg began to do from about 1946 on, at a time when that was far indeed from the received view, gave Greenberg, in retrospect, credentials of a kind few other critics enjoyed, that very few critics enjoy parallel credentials today. It also came to constitute a criterion for goodness in a critic, that one makes discoveries of a parallel sort, which has inevitably had certain consequences in subsequent critical practice. The critic is supposed to make discoveries in order to validate his or her good or practiced eye, and that's defined for the critic the role of champion for one or another artist. One's stature as a critic rises and falls with the reputation of the artist in whose goodness one has staked, on whose goodness one has staked one's critical reputation. The critic in search of credentials stalks the unknown or the under-recognized, which in part gives hope to the marginal gallery, to the fresh talent, to the venturesome dealer, and it tends to keep the productive system from rigidification. The reverse of that has been the confession of an insufficiently good eye, when the artist a critic opposes turns out, after all, to have been good or even great. And often, of course, that can be accounted for along the same lines Greenberg adduces in connection with the resistance to abstract art that he was dealing with, where it could be argued that the stubborn critics, thinking primarily, I think, in those years of the critic of the New York Times, John Kennedy, will not open their eyes because of some prior a priori theory of what art's got to be. For example, that it has to be in some sense representational. What Greenberg designates as the opponents of abstract art will argue that the experience of abstract art is not artistic experience, and he writes that works of abstract art be classified as art, properly speaking. And one feels that clearly it must have been certain prior definitions of art which prevented those hostile to Impressionism from seeing the goodness of those canvases, or which made it impossible to see the goodness of post-impressionist painting, or made it possible in 1863 and 1865 to see the goodness or the greatness even of Manet. I mean, Manet was really ridiculed. He felt with anguish the scorn of the critical establishment and the laughter of the people who stood in front of a painting like Déjeuner sur l'herbe. So the implication was that if people would just open their eyes, and equally important, open their minds by allowing the mind to take its cue from what the practiced eye delivers, there will be, just as Kant suggests, no final disagreement. Quality in art, Greenberg writes further, is not just a matter of private experience. He says there is a consensus of taste. The best taste is that of the people who, in each generation, spend the most time and trouble on art. And this best taste has always turned out to be unanimous within certain limits in its verdicts. If each individual, that's to say, cultivates an open mind and, to use a favorite expression of Greenberg's, just bears down hard enough, there will be no ultimate major disagreements. The idea of a mind not closed by theory and of trusting to sustained visual experience alone is almost caricatured in Greenberg's mode of confronting a painting. At a memorial meeting a year after Greenberg's death, the painter Jules Olitsky, whom Greenberg in later years celebrated as our most important painter, our finest painter. There's a painting of Jules Olitsky called Green Goes Round, done around 1967. It's not what Olitsky's doing right at the moment, but it's what he was doing when Greenberg formed the unfailingly high regard he had for Olitsky. But Olitsky described the format of a studio visit from Greenberg. Greenberg would stand with his back to a new painting until the painting was put in place, and then he would wheel abruptly around to let his practiced eye take it in without giving the mind a chance to interpose any prior theories. It's as though there were a race between the transmission of visual stimuli and the speed of thought. And if you could just sort of get there before the mind got there, you would, and trust that, then that's what the art was. There are innumerable anecdotes regarding Greenberg along those lines, and I think it used to take groups into a gallery and have them close their eyes, and then at a certain point you take your hands away, and then you just hope that the painting comes in before the mind can do its mischief. And that, I think, became probably a sort of standard posture in studios and galleries around at that time. Thomas Hoving, who was as you know, the director of the Metropolitan Museum, describes the setting for two of the major acquisitions during his tenure in just those terms: the portrait of Juan de Pareja by Velázquez, and this, which Hoving describes as the most beautiful work of art he'd ever seen. The crater of Euphronius, which the Met paid $1 million for, and which the Times called the Met's $1 million pot. But Hoving defended it, as I say, as the most beautiful work of his entire experience. In the former case, I mean, when he went to see the Velázquez, he refused to look at the painting until his assistants got were there at the lights. I mean, and then Hoving said, "Hit me," right? And then they turned on the lights, and the Velázquez flooded in, and he knew right off the bat that what this preconceptualized beauty that the eye admitted into his experience was great. Similarly, with the pot, he wouldn't look at it. He just didn't want to see it until he couldn't control the lights, but he went to see it at a house, little a villa in Switzerland, and they had to carry it out in the garden. And then again, he would say, "Well, are you ready?" And they'd say, "Yes." And then he'd go out, and it would do its work. Here's I took that out of the book. This is Making the Mummies Dance. This is from Hoving's autobiography. There he is in the garden with the Euphronius crater, and there is his curator of classical art touching it, and so forth. But I love the way which he just recoils. I mean, it's like a picture of somebody who's just been shot practically, and that's the that was the experience, on the basis of which he then got people to do the dog work, that is to say, the authentication and figure out the provenance and so forth, and then persuade his trustees that these were works that were very well worth spending a lot more money than anybody thought you'd have to spend on anything. And yeah, in the end, he was right. Greenberg would say very little other than grunt a kind of approval or disapproval. In a late interview, actually this is the final text in recently published collected essays and criticism, Greenberg voices a corollary of the tenet regarding the authority of experience. Asked to state criteria for the difference between minor and major art, he stated, well, there are criteria, but they just can't be put into words, any more than the difference between good and bad in art can be put into words. Works of art move you to a greater or lesser extent, and that's all. So far, words have been futile in the matter. Nobody hands out prescriptions to art and artists. You just wait and see what happens, see what the artist does. It's striking that critical response is seen by Greenberg as, in a funny way, of a piece with artistic creation, just as what one might expect from his suspiciousness toward rules, which was, after all, a position Kant worked out in connection with artistic genius, granting, of course, the difference between taste and genius, between what Kant calls a judging and not a productive faculty. Greenberg's monosyllabic utterances, a kind of visceral responses put into words, but words which were themselves audible visceral responses, were the critic's counterpart to the coming from the guts of painterly gesture in the sort of art with which Greenberg must always be identified. Abstract expressionism, though he deplored this as a label. Greenberg could hardly have achieved his tremendous reputation as a critic by grunts and grimaces. It's altogether instructive, for example, to read his review in November 1943 of Jackson Pollock's first exhibition at the Peggy Guggenheim Gallery, Art of the Century. Of course, he had by then seen a certain amount of Pollock's work through studio visits, which perhaps very similar to the one that Jules Olitsky described, movingly and comically. It was just very beautiful to hear Olitsky with a New York accent, which I thought had vanished, describe those experiences at Greenberg's service. But in his review, he gives reasons why Pollock's paintings are good. And even if the ascertainment of their goodness was a function of the eye. And one might add, without taking a scrap away from any credit due Greenberg, this would have been a function of the fact that others whose taste he admired, Lee Krasner, who was Pollock's wife, Hans Hofmann, Pete Mondrian, and Peggy Guggenheim herself, were unanimous in their admiration of Pollock. In the end, the task of the critic was to say what was good and what was not, based always on the deliverance of the eye as a kind of seventh sense, a sense of the beautiful in art, knowing it was art. If we think of it as what I term response-based criticism, then the tradition is being carried forward by critics very much less philosophically fortified in their practice than Greenberg was. I mean, I think of a critic like Peter Schjeldahl as out-and-out response-based critic. I just love to read Peter Schjeldahl because I like his responses and I'm interested in the way in which he describes them, but he is a response-based critic. Greenberg effectively stopped writing criticism in the middle 60s, maybe the late 60s. And it's difficult not to suppose that he stopped because his entire practice as a critic was unable to gain a relevant purchase on an artistic practice governed by the principle articulated by the two most influential artistic theorists of that era, Andy Warhol and Joseph Beuys, that anything can be an artwork, that there's no special way that artworks have to look, that anyone can be an artist. Thesis that Warhol advances in his painting by the numbers paintings, which look pretty much like what anybody can do. I mean, painting by the numbers paintings are manufactured for people to do you can paint a picture. You buy a kit and you get a canvas board and you just follow the numbers and that'll come out. Greenberg, according to a recollection by William Phillips, was singularly egalitarian in a funny way. He really did think that anyone could paint. And he really thought that anybody could paint, but he certainly wouldn't have regarded this as a painting. He spoke of, Phillips says, Greenberg tried to get him. He said, you can paint. Anybody can paint. He said, but I can't stand the smell of paint. And that got in the lesson's way. He was never able to overcome that sensory barrier and so forth. But I did hear Greenberg's widow read from a moving but extraordinarily callow letter written in his 30s describing his own first effort at painting, which he thought was just marvelous. He thought it was just marvelous. He said, well, he said, painting, it's just as natural to me as making love. But he was not an ontological egalitarian. He thought anybody could paint, but he didn't think all paintings were necessarily good for that reason. I'm not so sure that Beuys or Warhol necessarily thought that all paintings were good either, but that's another story, because the goodness of the kind of works that we identify with Warhol and with Beuys have very little to do with aesthetic goodness, which is what I'm coming to now. He would have dismissed the painting by the number paintings of Warhol, I think the title of that is Anyone Can Do It, as inconsistent with the philosophy of art that he'd learned through Kant. They could be achieved, these could be achieved by following rules, by putting red where the numbers said one should put red, yellow where the numbers said one should put yellow. Now, obviously, Warhol didn't follow any particular rule. It was part of Warhol's genius at a certain moment to decide to do a painting like that and call it anyone can do it. It was part of his way of saying anything can be a work of art or anyone can be an artist. But that work of art was certainly not done by following rules. That was part of Warhol's genius, and I don't know that he certainly didn't follow any rule, but it would have been altogether consistent with his impulses that he get a painting by the number kit and do it and put it up for sale and sign it Andy and see what it might bring in the market. Whatever the case, he didn't, but let's imagine that he did, and he exhibited the work. The eye, or the practiced eye, couldn't especially tell that an artist had filled in the numbered cells, since the result would look like the real thing, namely what someone at a senior citizen center might have done on a rainy day. And it would inherit whatever aesthetic qualities the latter had. And yet they'd have very different artistic qualities. Warhol might have been making a statement about anyone being an artist in doing that. He would be making a statement about painting having to be something that's torn from the artist's guts. Or the former trolley conductor in the senior citizen recreation center who paints by the numbers is simply moving step by step, following the rules to the achievement of a pretty picture. But Warhol, had he read Kant, could have been, by means of this painting, making a comment on the third critique. Pop art, or much of it, was based on commercial art. on illustration, labels, package design, posters. They were all, or most of them, commercial artists. Warhol was the most successful commercial artist of his time. He won prize after prize as a commercial artist. As a commercial artist, you're responsible for those colorful proclamatory images that sold products. And you had to have a good eye to be a good commercial artist. De Kooning had been a sign painter, so had Rosenquist been a sign painter. And it's difficult to suppose that in appropriating to the ends of fine art the special equipment of a sign painter, de Kooning did not similarly appropriate the eye that made him successful as a commercial artist. I mean, this isn't necessarily a great work. This is de Kooning. Those drawings are de Kooning's drawings. That's the portrait of Elaine de Kooning next to that. I mean, it really doesn't stagger the soul, but you can, without much difficulty, work it out that the guy who did that, and went on to do the fierce women and the woman paintings that de Kooning did. My concern here is just to suggest that each of those commercial efforts was selected by someone with a good eye who said, confronting the Campbell's soup label or the Brillo box design, that's it, you've got it, don't touch it. And then it would go into production. The pop artists appropriated designs which had already passed an aesthetic test of some sort, which were selected because the image was it was supposed that it would catch the eye, that it would burn its way into the appetitive system, that it would burn in the imagination. But what made pop art high art rather than commercial art had only incidentally to do with the aesthetic qualities that caused it to succeed as commercial art. Let's see. Sorry. I must have done something wrong here. Yeah, I mean, that's Warhol. He decided to do all the Campbell soup can. That was exhibited at the Bloom Gallery in Los Angeles in the early 60s. And I don't know who designed the Campbell soup label, but it certainly sold an awful lot of soup. It sold enough soup to make it a candidate for whatever it was that Warhol was doing when, certainly for the first time in American art, he did something like this. But what these works are about has nothing to do with the aesthetics of the soup label, has nothing to do with the qualities that made him so extraordinary as a commercial artist. The art criticism of pop art, which is a genre of art I've always found intoxicating, has nothing to do with what met the eye, since what met the eye only explained its interest and value as commercial art, and the eye alone could not account for the difference. But that would have been true with so much of the art of the 60s and the 70s, and of the 90s as well. The 80s was in some ways a bit retrograde as a moment because of the reassertion of painting as the dominant mode of art making, that the Kantian art critic would have been reduced to silence or to splutter in the face, and I'll just flash on some of these, of the slashed felt. This is a work by Robert Morris from, I think, 1967. It's untitled, but in parentheses, Tangle. Might have somewhat easier time with this House of the Veti, also by Morris and done in heavy felt, because it looks like something that would satisfy Kantian criteria, but the tangle certainly wouldn't. Here is a work by from 19. I can't memorize the titles in this case, but this is a work by Barry Levay, L-E-V-A, the title of which is "Within the Series of Layered Pattern Acts," and then in parentheses, thrown from 3 feet, 6 feet, and 12 feet, 1968 to 1970. Those are just panes of, well, just panes of glass that have been thrown from 3 feet, 6 feet, 12 feet. And I mean, you can recreate that work anytime you want. But you've destroyed the utility of the glass, but what precisely in the way of aesthetic goodness have you produced? But you've produced something that you have to go into the theories of the late 60s to get into. This is Richard Serra, a work called Castings from Four Molds. Four molds. The molds in this case were just the place where the wall meets the floor. Serra just flung molten lead and used what you'd call natural molds. This was actually at Castelli's warehouse in the Bronx, and then when it cooled, you pried it out and you laid it up. And in parentheses, that is for Eva Hess, the artist Eva Hess. Here is a work by Richard Tuttle from 1972. You can hardly make it out, and it may be backwards, but it's called 17th Wire Piece, and it looks pretty much like that. That's a piece of twisted wire. It's the kind of thing Tuttle did a lot of at that particular time. It formed part of what was called the new sculpture in the period from about 1965 to 1975. Here's a piece by the great Eva Hess herself. This is called Area from 1968, done just 2 years before her death, and that's just latex soaked cloth. Here is another work from a little bit later. Sorry. Yeah. Did I do that? Yeah. This is Dei Ching Shi and Linda Montano. It's called 1 Year Performance, which they did in 1983. They were tethered for that entire year, the two of them, and it was sort of a heroic work. They didn't touch one another in that entire year, but they undertook this as a work of art, as a piece of art, not easily classified under traditional canons, to see what it would be like. Here is a work by Gordon Matta Clark. It's called Splitting, and he's cutting a house in half, is what it amounts to. Well, the people whose house it were Holly Solomon, the art dealer, and her husband. They didn't want the house anymore, and Gordon Matta Clark was making sculpture out of split houses, carving floors, etc., and created an enormous amount of interest at that time. Another work that I'll talk a little bit about, this by Robert Morris, 1961. It's called Box with the Sound of Its Own Construction. What Morris did was to make a tape recording consisting of hammerings and sawings that went into the production of this particular box. That's sort of a sample, little anthology of work that comes from that period. It's not particularly distinguished carpentry, but it has an extraordinary kind of interest. For example, it's very clear that Morris, who studied philosophy, thought that a box with a memory had something to tell us about the mind-body problem. And Greenberg would have no way of dealing with a work like this. In 1969, he wrote, with an almost, I think, breathtaking obtuseness, "Art in any medium, boiled down to what it does in the experience of it, creates itself through relations and proportions. The quality of art depends on inspired felt relations or proportions and on nothing else. There's no getting around that. A simple unadorned box can succeed as art by virtue of these things. And when it fails as art, it's not because it's a plain box, but because its proportions, or even its size, are uninspired and unfelt." The same applies to works in any form of what he called disparagingly novelty art. No amount of phenomenal describable newness avails when the internal relations of the work have not been felt, inspired, and discovered. The superior work of art, whether it's dance or whether it dances, radiates, explodes, or barely manages to be visible or audible or decipherable, exhibits, in other words, rightness of form. To that extent, Greenberg says, art remains unchangeable. It'll never be able to take effect as art except through quality. I think Morris's work here is brilliant and inspired, and it certainly has quality as a work of art, but hardly quality as defined by rightness of form. Greenberg felt that the art of the 60s was, beneath surface appearances, singularly homogeneous and even monotonous. He even ventured to identify the common underlying style as what Wölfflin, the author of Principles of Art History, would call linear. His tone in that late essay is biting, sarcastic, and dismissive. It was the kind of response we recognize whenever a revolutionary movement has occurred in art, that the artists are out to shock, or that they've forgotten how to draw, or they're behaving like very bad boys and girls. Whether it's to his credit or not, he never changed his mind for the last 30 years of his life. I heard him say these very things in 1992. Art had gone through a revolutionary moment, one which invalidated forever, I thought, the supposedly easy transit from aesthetics to art criticism. They could only be connected by revising aesthetics as a discipline through changes in critical practice the revolutions of the 60s imposed. Now, I think what I want to do, because I want to get in something that's not commonly brought into these discussions. I want to skip my discussion of Greenberg's second tenet, because I think the general argument that I'd want to make is fairly clear, that however you're going to deal critically with these kinds of works, the good eye doesn't have a lot to do with it, and visual responses won't have a lot to do with it. And so let me just very quickly come to the last part of my talk. I'm an essentialist in philosophy. I'm committed to the view that art is, in a sense, eternally the same, in the sense, that is to say, that there are conditions necessary and sufficient for something to be an artwork, and that those are invariant as to time and place. That, in a way, is the line I took in the Transfiguration of the Commonplace, and it's the line I generally take in philosophy. But I'm a historicist as well, and I'm committed to the view that what is a work of art at one time couldn't have been a work of art at another time. And in particular, that there's a history enacted through the history of art, in which the essence of art, that's to say the necessary and sufficient conditions, are very painfully brought to consciousness. Enormous amounts of the world's artworks were made in times and places, occupied by people who had no concept of art to speak of, for reasons wholly of what they took their interests to be: cave paintings, fetishes, altarpieces. It's true that today we have really little relationship to those objects other than contemplative, since the interests are not our own interests, and the beliefs in the light of which they were regarded as effective can no longer be widely held, least of all among those who admire the works in question. It would be a mistake to suppose this contemplation belongs to their essence as artworks, for it's almost certainly true that those who made them had little interest in their contemplation. But in any case, the makeshift notions of satisfaction, An sich, or Schopenhauer's will-less perception, I don't think have a lot of conceptual finesse, at the very least, as a definition of the aesthetic. I mean, it has about the same as featherless biped has when you're trying to define human beings. It won't get you very far. I think there is just possibly a universal aesthetic notion, which had for a time, fatefully for the time when the originary works of aesthetic philosophy were framed, a certain application to works of art. So that for that time, the work of art was at an intersection of crossed universals. The universal which belongs to art by essentialist considerations, and the universal aesthetic which belongs to humans and perhaps to animal in their sensibility through being coded for genetically. And about that, I'm going to say a few reckless final words. I've lately been struck by some empirical work in psychology which strongly supports the thesis that there are perceptions of beauty which cut across cultural lines. 1994 study in the magazine Nature, scientific periodical Nature, that's what I want. I knew that thing was never going to show up. There is one last slide, but it shows two women, the faces of two women, and but you'll just take this description for what it's worth. This 1994 study in Nature reported that both British and Japanese men and women ranked women's faces that were shown them on slides. These were computer altered faces. They ranked women's faces in orders of attractiveness when certain features were exaggerated, like large eyes, high cheekbones, and a narrow jaw. Caucasians, moreover, ranked Japanese women's faces the same way Japanese themselves did. And the authors of the article claim, quote, there are greater similarities than differences in cross-cultural judgments of facial attractiveness. The faces used were achieved by the computer, and the most attractive faces exaggerated certain traits in such a way as to give empirical support to a thesis of Schopenhauer's, actually, that the visual arts yield what he called Platonic ideas of the beauty found in actual persons. The features in question are exaggerations in much the same way that the tails of peacocks are exaggerations, but they are, in a commentary on the study, said to imply certain highly desirable traits in their owners, perhaps in the same way the tremendous feather display of the peacock does, to such traits as resistance to disease, fertility, and youth. And again, I think Schopenhauer has something right when he refers to what he calls the marvelous sense of beauty of the Greeks. He says, which enabled them alone of all nations to set up for the imitation of all nations the standards of beauty and grace. And we can say that that which, if it remains unseparated from the will, gives sexual impulse with its discriminating selection, that's to say sexual love, that becomes the objective sense of beauty for the human form when,
by reason of the presence of an abnormally preponderating intellect, it detaches itself from the will and yet remains active. And needless to add, we have the natural myth of the sculptor who creates a statue of a woman he would fall in love with if she were real, giving vividness to Kant's idea that natural and artistic beauty are one. Now that, as I suggested, a certain level of abstractness cuts across not only cultural lines, but lines of species. Evolutionary biologists have lately begun to associate symmetry with sexual desirability in a wide range of species. The female scorpion fly shows invariant preferences for males with symmetrical wings. The female barn swallow prefers a male with symmetrical wishbone patterns of feathers, the same size and color on both sides of the tail. Asymmetrical antlers will cut the male who has them out of the mating game. Symmetry is perhaps a sign that the male has an immune system resistance to certain parasites which are known to cause uneven growth. This is a growing field of experimentation, but it suggests there being nothing more practical than sex, that dear old natural selection accounts for aesthetic preferences which the clever Greeks introduced into their art, where, or even when, the will was out of play, because we know them to be statuary. We would enjoy looking at them with the same prurient eyes we cast on one another. You may not be able to put it all into words. I mean, the scorpion fly certainly can't. But you can go a long way in that direction from the perspectives of evolutionary biology. The principles of good design are the same as the outward emblems of health and fertility, a consideration which rejoins the somewhat morally difficult identification of goodness with beauty and badness with its absence, as in the philosophies of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. Of course, there are complicating factors with human beings. A human male with a disfigurement parallel to the elk with asymmetrical antlers can procure a sexual partner with high cheekbones and a narrow jaw if he happens to have pots of money, a mismatch due to cultural mischievous which gives rise to the basic situation of comedy. And everyone in the world can specify the physical attributes of the attractive male who makes up the third figure in the eternal triangle. But now that we know that chimpanzees are carnivores, we also have discovered that an ill-favored male with a haunch of monkey meat to share can secure the sexual favors of the classiest female in the clan. Schopenhauer denies that symmetry is a necessary condition of beauty, offering a counterexample in the case of ruins. One doesn't idly offer counterexamples. The thesis of symmetry and beauty had to have been in the air, and the move from symmetry to ruin marks the transition in the history of taste from neoclassicism to romanticism. There are ruins and ruins, of course, some more beautiful than others, but it seems to me that with them, we more or less leave the sphere in which sexual response is triggered and enter the sphere of meaning. We leave, in Hegel's terms, the sphere of natural beauty for the beauty of art and what he termed spirit. The ruin connotes the relentlessness of time, the decay of power, the inevitability of death. The ruin is a romantic medium, a poem in the medium of fallen stones. The ruin is like the cherry trees in bloom when we visit the cherry trees to see the bloom and think of the transiency of the features which give us a leg up in the evolutionary Olympics, the fragility of beauty, the passage of time. We think of Haussmann, of the springs that will not come again. Even if nobody made the blossoms, somebody planted the trees, and as Hegel puts it in speaking of the work of art, it is essentially a question, an address to the responsive breast, a call to the mind and the spirit. And that's true of Robert Morris, as it is of Andy Warhol, as it is of Pollock, as it is of Mondrian, as it is of Hals, as it is of Vermeer. In the famous passage on the end of art, Hegel speaks of the intellectual judgment, and the numbering is his, as one, the content of art, and two, the work of art's means of presentation. Criticism needs nothing further. It needs to identify meaning and mode of presentation, or what I'd term embodiment, on the thesis that artworks are embodied meanings. The mistake of Kantian art criticism is that it segregates form from content, but beauty is part of the content of the works it prized, and their mode of presentation asks us to respond to the meaning of beauty. All that can be put into words when one does art criticism. Putting all that into words is what art criticism is. Thank you.